Hello there. Well, let's get this video off to a risky but exciting start. Here's my underpants. In fact, I've got two pairs, fresh from the drawer. Let's just have a closer look. Made in China. What about these ones? Made in India. And this is a little external hard drive that I bought just to store stuff from the computer. Let's have a look. Assembled in Thailand, a product of China. And this is the box that my new computer monitor came in, which is just there. Let's have a look. Made in China. What a surprise. And this is a saw I've had for a while, made in B&Q. Haven't used it for a while because the last time I used it, it did my back in. I'll not be doing any sawing anymore. It doesn't say where it was made. It's fairly cheap saw. But in fact, China is today the main exporter of saws in the world. So it wouldn't surprise me if this too was made in China. Are you starting to see a bit of a trend here? I'm trying to create a trend. In the excellent online website, The Glasgow Story, they have 3 photographs dating to around 1910 that show the inside of a factory in Elliot Street, sort of between Anderson and Finnieston. Yeah, it's William Cook and Sons saw factory. These, I think, are photographs owned by Glasgow Museums. Excellent photographs showing the inside of the factory and men making saws. And you know, in the old days, we used to make things, and these days we still make things. We just don't make as many things as we used to. And back in the old days, a lot of people were employed in making the things that we needed. We didn't get as much stuff from abroad as we do these days. And if I go back to my underpants, ta-da! One pair made in India, one pair made in China. It wasn't that long ago that Marks and Spencer's turned its back on the UK workforce. And in doing so, they put out in total something approaching about 4,500 workers out of work. I mean, as I said, in the old days, we used to make much of what we needed in our daily lives. We even made our own gas. Every town and village in Scotland and in the rest of the UK had a gasworks where they made gas that would supply that town or village. And it's a rather sad state of affairs that so many things do come from abroad. Electricity, for example. The electricity that we use in our daily lives is generally owned by foreign companies. And all the profits from that will go to some foreign country and to shareholders around the world who are getting rich on our backs. Even water. Something as basic as water in certain parts of the UK is now in the hands of foreign companies. And again, you've got a shareholder situation where people are getting rich on the back of people who are struggling to heat their house, wondering whether they should flush the toilet after every pee because of the cost involved. The whole situation has got really a bit ridiculous. And in short, the UK economy is not just Scotland, it's the whole of the UK. The economy is in absolute tatters. There's not enough money for anything. Not enough money for the NHS. There's so many services that don't have enough money. Councils around the country. Police force, not enough policemen. Everything is struggling. And the whole of the UK is on a slippery slope to nowhere. It is surely up to governments to protect the population in any number of ways. And that surely includes protecting jobs and industry. What have governments been doing over the past number of decades? Surely they should have been introducing really high import taxes or duties or whatever you might want to call it, so that it made it unrealistic for certain goods to be imported from foreign countries, thereby forcing the UK to make these goods and allowing the UK to grow and expand with a workforce that was working, instead of twiddling its thumbs at home, wondering how to spend the little money that it has, and ultimately ending up buying cheap crap from abroad. It is surely time for Scotland and the whole of the UK to really get a grip, and for governments to pull their finger out. We can no longer have electricity and the power that we need in our daily lives to be in the hands of foreign companies and rich shareholders. That has to stop. And it's the same with water and other essential things that we need. These basic things cannot be in the hands of foreign countries. And we have to take some action to sort this right now, or the UK is going nowhere fast. There's got to be a way of arresting the situation and bringing some hope back to the country, and some sort of hope of an economic upturn. Because at the moment it's just not happening. We don't have to be scrabbling about in the muck left over from foreign firms and shareholders getting rich around the world. So this is the 7th video in the series Old Photos of Scotland. I've called it The Working Man, but as I think you'll see, that there's quite a fair number of working women as well. I think I've used the word man in a general sense to encompass perhaps the whole human race. Working men, women, and those who might like to fiddle with their pronouns. So sit back and enjoy what follows.
So, we're starting with a woman, then a man, both working in Dundee's jute industry around the 1890s. In the mid-19th century, around half of the working population of Dundee were employed in the city's jute industry, where jute fibres imported from India were made into sacking cloth. The mills in India were mostly managed by Scots, India being dominated first by British merchants of the East India Company, then forcibly ruled by the Crown as part of the British Empire. However, in 1947, India gained its independence from British rule, and the country was partitioned into India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Throughout the 20th century, Dundee's jute industry saw a decline as India itself began to dominate the industry, more so after the country was free from British rule. There is therefore something a little ironic about me moaning about undies made in India and not the UK. The word payback springs to mind. A bit more like a factory now, and a rather serious-looking bunch of guys with sticks and bonnets engaged in the preparation of animal skins in Edinburgh in 1920. Probably not a lot of fun to be had in animal skins. A joiner's shop in Morris's Furniture Factory at Cowcaddens in Glasgow is sometime around the early 20th century. A couple of small boys in there among the men, and everyone looks fairly well attired with aprons and kind expressions. We can, of course, also start to see some of the equipment prevalent in factories in the old days. Line shafts and belts and wheels used to drive machinery, and in some factories there was a lot of it. Like in this factory in Edinburgh in 1895. That's a lot of people in a fairly small space, and if you combine all those belt-driven machines with the long-sleeved dresses worn by the women, it's not hard to see the potential for accidents. Sometimes work meant doing what was required to simply survive. You weren't working for a boss, you were working to stay alive. This is the occupants of St Kilda around the year 1890, and it's a very telling image. If you look closely, many of the women are knitting. Survival was a 24-hour job. But if you look even closer, many of the women are very thin, with faces that are almost skeletal. It must have been a truly hard life. The island was finally evacuated in 1930. This is more women. Goodness, but wasn't there a lot of them around? At the Bloomvale Carpet Factory in the Bridgeton area of Glasgow in 1922. That's a lot of very young women, no doubt glad of a few moments of respite from a working day that could be up to 12 hours. One of the most stunning images in this whole bunch is this one of a cork-cutting business in Edinburgh's Easter Road in 1895. Cork was used as bottle and jar stoppers at the time. But just look at the number of women and machines. The noise of the machinery must have been hell. But rather than being overhead, the line shaft and belts and wheels that drove the machinery is thankfully at ground level, which was perhaps a little safer than those that were overhead. There are over 100 women working in the photo. At times, work was more of a solitary affair, and here we see a small boy at a smelting furnace somewhere in Glasgow, possibly in a railway workshop in the 1860s. The boy looks to be only 10 or 12 years old. A number of factory acts were passed in the 19th century to stifle the exploitation of women and children in factories. The Act passed in 1844, for example, limited the number of hours that could be worked by children aged between 13 and 18 to 12 hours per day. Later in the century, in 1874, a further act was passed where any child under 9 years of age could no longer be employed in a mill. But children just 8 years old could still be employed in workshops and non-textile factories. Here we see the workforce of the Edinburgh and Leith Flint Glass Works in 1925. And with a few exceptions, that's basically just a whole load of children. The boy at the front looks like he's about 8. For all the acts that were passed, it took many years for change to be effective. And even by 1939, we still had very young men, if not small boys, employed in areas of heavy industry. This is a Glasgow shipyard in that very year, and we can only hope that he had, at the very least, steel toe-capped shoes. Women, as we've perhaps already touched on, were not immune to exploitation and working conditions that were frankly unbelievable. This is Glebe Sugar Refinery in Greenock in November 1918, at the close of the First World War. And yes, those women are working in bare feet. I'm not sure if having bare feet was somehow part of whatever process they were engaged in, or whether they simply could not afford shoes. I think it's unlikely that they were all so impoverished. But certainly there are photos dating to around the start of the 20th century showing children and some women in bare feet. A long ground-length skirt could hide a multitude of sins. The picture was one of a number commissioned for the Imperial War Museum and designed to portray a positive image of women during the war. For all the hardship during the Great War, there were many happy faces smiling out at us from old photographs, folk making the best of their lot. This is 3 young women in a Dundee rope factory, also in 1918. They too are in bare feet, yet it would be hard to find a happier bunch of people. During the 1914-1918 war, women performed many essential roles while the men were fighting in France. This is the Copla Hill tram depot, now the tramway in Albert Drive in Glasgow, and a woman is making an aeroplane. We sometimes think of women knitting and making things like jumpers or doilies, yet here is one making a flying machine. She also has the luxury of shoes. It's perhaps worth remembering here that it wasn't until 1928 that all women over 21 years of age were given the right to vote. Women performed many crucial roles during the Great War. Here we see one making bombs, or bomb casings, at the Lamhill Ironworks. Again, she looks perfectly content, carrying out a job that must at times have carried more than its fair share of risk. It was not unknown for explosions to occur in munitions factories, along with the loss of many young female lives. Remaining with working women, and here we see one making a warship, again during the First World War. It's at Alexander and Stephen and Sons Linthouse Yard in Govan around 1916. It was at the time a concern to some that women could so easily perform tasks previously carried out by skilled men. By the end of the war, there were more than 28,000 women carrying out essential munitions and construction work for the war effort along the River Clyde. Here's a lot of unemployed men at a labour exchange somewhere in Scotland. Does anyone recognise the location? That narrow building on the right-hand side must surely be a clue. The photo looks to date to perhaps the 1930s. Certainly the 1930s saw a decline in heavy industry like shipbuilding and coal mining, and in Glasgow alone in 1933 around a third of the male workforce was out of work. There were many factors at play, but certainly the world, and not just Scotland, was experiencing a major depression at the time. It wasn't called the Great Depression for nothing. Outside of major cities, life was often very different to the hustle and bustle of the big smoke. Here we see some folk carrying out essential preparation work in the fishing community of West Haven in Carnoustie in 1880. For some reason, it's a mildly scary image. You wouldn't want to bump into these folk on a dark night. I think it's the combination of strange clothing and the stare on the face of the woman. These people lived a hard life, and it shows. Another fishing village, this time at an unknown location in Scotland, and more preparation work in the 1870s or 1880s. There's an underlying atmosphere of mischief. Look at the expression on the face of the lad second from the left. I suspect the photographer had his hands full trying to get them all to look seriously industrious. You can see one lad in bare feet, and a whole range of costume types that at times looks more like the Wild West than Scotland. Back to the big smoke and the calm interior of the library in Main Street, Gorbals in 1907. It's a very well organised interior, with each newspaper laid out in its own specific spot: the Evening Citizen, Daily Record, Scotsman, etc. It must have been a slightly intimidating interior for the young woman working by the counter, with any number of men sneaking admiring glances at her from behind the cover of their newspaper. Port Glasgow in the mid-1970s, and men clocking off at Scott Lithgow's Kingston shipyard at the end of their shift. It's a mixed bunch of guys, a few of whom would probably wind down with a pint in the nearest pub. Back to Glasgow, and here's men laying those cobbles or stones in the road, the ones that are sometimes uncovered when the modern road surface wears away, as it does frequently. This is Clyde Street in the early 1900s, and all the buildings shown have gone. It's just after the First World War, and here we see men making a tram in the previously mentioned Copla Hill tram depot in Albert Drive. Today, inside, you can still see the tram tracks on which newly finished trams would have moved about and ultimately exited the building for a life on the streets of Glasgow. The building was Glasgow's Museum of Transport for a while, as seen here in 1974, when one of the exhibits is finding its way inside. Finally, it's 1885, and some men are making a bridge. The iconic Forth Railway Bridge at Queensferry. It's just such an astonishing image. When you look at the seemingly haphazard, jumbly nature of what's going on, you wonder how on earth we ever managed to build one of the finest long-lasting bridges in the world. Around 73 men lost their lives during its construction, the ranges ranging from just 13 up to 63. Today, the bridge is a World Heritage Site.